If you had told me that evening would end with my husband's billionaire boss gripping my hand in front of 300 people, claiming he had spent 2 decades searching for me, I would have laughed. I was standing in the deepest corner of that grand ballroom, wearing a clearance rack dress, trying to blend into the wallpaper just as I had done at all of Julian's corporate events. I had no idea that in exactly 4 minutes, my entire existence was going to split into a definite before and after. I was about to become visible again. My name is Clara Vance, and at 43, I had spent the last 18 years being Julian's wife first, and myself a distant second. That evening, the Sterling Group was celebrating its silver anniversary at the grandest hotel downtown, complete with towering ice sculptures, expensive champagne, and a classical quartet playing in the background. Julian had spent an hour in front of our bedroom mirror adjusting his tie, instructing me on how to behave. He told me to wear the dark plum dress, and explicitly ordered me to stay quiet and not embarrass him. Once we arrived, Julian transformed into his usual corporate persona, laughing too loudly at his colleagues' jokes and working the room like a man auditioning for a promotion. I trailed behind him quietly, offering polite smiles whenever he bothered to introduce me, which was rare. Eventually, I drifted toward the catering table to sip on club soda and watch him perform from afar. A few minutes later, Julian cornered me, his fingers squeezing my arm tightly as he hissed in my ear that I looked like a ghost and needed to smile more. I merely nodded and stepped back, letting the familiar ache settle into my chest. I had spent nearly 2 decades believing that a quiet wife was a supportive wife, swallowing my own identity to keep the peace. But the energy in the ballroom suddenly shifted before I could dwell on my sadness. The loud chatter dwindled to respectful whispers, and every head turned toward the grand entrance. It was Arthur Sterling, the founder and chairman of the entire empire, a man Julian spoke of with absolute reverence and fear. Arthur was 6'2", silver-haired, and possessed a natural authority that commanded the room without effort. He moved through the crowd, exchanging brief pleasantries, but his sharp eyes seemed to be searching for someone specific in the crowd. Then, his gaze locked onto me, and his entire face changed. It was an expression of utter shock, as if he were looking at a ghost he had long stopped believing he would ever see again. He abandoned his conversation mid-sentence and walked straight toward me. The crowd parted naturally as Arthur advanced, leaving me standing frozen by the appetizer table, wondering what I could have possibly done wrong. He stopped directly in front of me, his gray eyes shining with unshed tears, and gently took both of my hands in his. His voice trembled as he whispered that he had spent 20 years looking for me. The entire ballroom went dead silent, and even the musicians seemed to falter as 300 wealthy executives stared at us. I pulled back slightly, stammering that he must have mistaken me for someone else, but Arthur shook his head vigorously. He insisted he would recognize my face anywhere, his grip tightening as tears actually spilled down his cheeks. Over his shoulder, I saw Julian standing near the bar, his drink frozen halfway to his mouth, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed reality shatter into pieces in a matter of seconds. Arthur wiped his eyes, completely unbothered by the fact that his entire board of directors was watching him weep. He explained that 20 years ago, during a blinding winter storm on Route 9, his car had hit black ice and plunged into a deep ravine. He was trapped inside the crushed vehicle, unable to feel his legs, and fully believed he was going to die alone in the freezing dark. But then, a young woman driving in the opposite direction stopped. The memories suddenly rushed back to me like a tidal wave. I was 23 back then, working exhausting double shifts at a highway diner to pay for my night classes. I remembered the screaming wind, the headlights cutting through the snow, and the sight of a crumpled sedan in a ditch. I remembered sliding down the muddy slope in my thin uniform, tearing at the jammed car door until my hands bled, and dragging a semi-conscious man to safety. I remembered holding my own woolen scarf against his bleeding forehead during the terrifying ambulance ride, staying by his side at the hospital until the doctors took him into surgery. Arthur explained to the crowd that I had only signed my first name, Clara, on the admission forms before slipping away into the night to catch my morning shift. He spent years hiring investigators and visiting every local diner, but with no last name, I had vanished completely. I quietly told him that I had only done what any decent person would do, but Arthur shook his head, declaring that I had saved his life when he had no reason to keep living. He explained that he built his entire empire on the second chance I gave him, carrying the debt of my anonymous kindness for 2 decades. I became aware of the crowd again, noticing people recording us on their phones, while Julian stared at me with pure, unadulterated disbelief. Arthur offered me a warm, genuine smile and bypassed all corporate protocol, keeping a comforting hand near my elbow as he turned to address the silent room. He loudly declared to his employees that without me, there would be no Sterling Group, no jobs, and no anniversary to celebrate. He announced that every single person in that room owed their livelihood to a woman who had saved him and asked for absolutely nothing in return. I felt my face burn under the intense spotlight, but for the first time in 18 years, I stood a little taller. Arthur then turned his gaze toward Julian, asking him directly if he knew that his own wife was the hero of this story. Julian stammered, offering a weak, forced laugh as he claimed I had simply forgotten to mention it. An executive from the crowd loudly pointed out how incredible it was that Julian didn't even know his own wife's history. Julian's face flushed a deep, angry red as his carefully polished reputation crumbled before his colleagues. He shot me a sharp, warning glance, silently pleading with me not to make things worse for him. But Arthur merely noted how remarkable it was that I had never used such a heroic deed for personal gain, calling it a rare level of integrity. He then formally invited me to sit at the prestigious head table as his guest of honor. Julian immediately stepped forward to join us, but Arthur politely yet firmly clarified that the invitation was for me alone. I watched my husband get quietly and publicly set aside in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. As I took Arthur's arm and walked toward the head table, I felt a quiet, powerful shift inside my chest. It was the feeling of finally being seen, and realizing just how much of myself I had sacrificed sitting at the grand table. My mind drifted back to the beginning of my marriage. I had met Julian when I was 25, mistaking his intense need for control as a sign of strength and protection. It hadn't vanished overnight, rather. My identity had been slowly eroded by his quiet criticisms, his dismissive comments about my career goals, and the silent, disapproving looks he gave me whenever I dared to speak up at social gatherings. I had never told Julian about the rescue because I honestly didn't think my own actions were important enough to share. Arthur, sitting beside me, seemed to sense my heavy thoughts and softly whispered that he had kept my blood-stained scarf in his desk drawer for 20 years as proof that his savior was real. He confessed that seeing how Julian spoke to me made him realize that the remarkable woman he had searched for had been hiding in plain sight. I glanced back at Julian, who was staring at us from his distant table with a jaw so tight it looked ready to snap. When a board member kindly asked what I did for a living, the old shame tried to rise in my throat, but I choked it down. I looked at Arthur, who had cherished my existence for 20 years, and decided I would never shrink myself to make Julian comfortable again. The gala concluded late, and the moment we stepped into the empty parking garage elevator, Julian's fury boiled over. He slammed his hand against the buttons, demanding to know why I had kept such a massive secret from him and claiming I had intentionally humiliated him. I looked at him calmly, noting the sheer panic in his eyes, and realized his anger was entirely born from his loss of control over me. I quietly explained that I had saved a dying stranger, not a corporate titan, and that I owed him no explanation for a life lived before him. Julian scoffed, pacing back and forth as he complained about how this would affect his standing at the office on Monday morning. He bitterly accused me of enjoying his public embarrassment, his voice echoing sharply off the cold concrete walls of the garage. As we walked to the car, I realized his words no longer had the power to hurt me. The quiet, invisible wife he had spent 18 years molding had stayed behind in that ballroom. I looked out the passenger window at the city lights, feeling a strange and beautiful sense of peace. I had spent 2 decades believing I was small, but tonight, I finally remembered who I was. Did you expect the husband to react so bitterly, or do you think his career-driven panic was inevitable?